Super excited to kick this off. We have a nice 30 minutes allocated here to just talk about DeFi for ReFi and really unpack what that is. And more specifically, I really want us to delve into this new topic of conversation, real world assets, and what those bring to the table. But also, the pain points, the perspectives of some people in that that niche area, and really how we can leverage these tools, whether they're traditional DeFi protocol, whether they're ReFi assets, or whether they're real world assets, to unlock opportunities to drive deep decarbonization and, of course, enhance global climate action. So very excited to have you three up here on stage doing your amazing work in this space. Let's kick it off with a round of intros. Who you are, what you do, and why you're really excited about this area. What you're doing in this ReFi, DeFi space, / how you see real world assets really playing an instrumental role.
Well, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it. I'm Ryan Thomas from Symbiotica Finance. I'm based here in Boston, so if you're local, please see me after. Let's convene and have more conversations. We love what's happening here today. A little bit about what we do is we are an impact asset aggregating platform that looks at the analytics, both market and impact-driven analytics of all digital assets that have the intrinsic properties of revenue models for linking impact to people and the planet on-chain, right? So if you are an asset that is producing carbon credits, by default, you're doing something good for the planet, and that is on-chain. If possible, it's on our index. And so you can look at all of our work that way, but we're moving well beyond carbon to social impact credits, nature-based solutions, other methods of decentralized science, and different scalable governance technologies. We're looking at all of them and trying to rate them based on their efficacy as a digital asset. So that's our kind of premier focus, and where we see ourselves looking for real-world assets in the future. Well, lots of companies are doing great things. To be able to have provenance of showing those great things on-chain, regardless of what chain it's on, is where we see a real approachable opportunity for traditional financiers and institutions to be able to actually leverage those claims that they want to make, whether it's an ESG claim or a corporate responsibility claim, whatever that looks like. The best way, the premier way, is with digital assets. And so that's our core thesis. So really excited about putting all those impact assets on-chain and bridging those assets, whether they're real world, into a digital environment so people can actually use those in one holistic environment.
Amazing. Sebastien?
Thank you for having me. So I'm Sebastien, CEO and co-founder of Blockgreen. We are a Zurich-based company. Glad to have made the trip to Boston to be here today. So Blockgreen is a capital market solution with a core focus on Bitcoin. Our thesis came from actually wanting to deploy and develop a solution that would allow traditional finance and institutions to be exposed to the Bitcoin mining space by providing liquidity to Bitcoin miners that have a clear strategy on how Bitcoin can better kind of grid usage, a renewable transition, and so on and so forth. So the way we structured our platform was to kind of allow Bitcoin miners to come and list the possibility for them to sell future hash rate production, so kind of the future Bitcoin that they will be mining, be vetted by us. So we centralize for now the onboarding of those miners, the vetting of their operations, especially looking at how they use energy, what is the energy source, to allow them to then access a capital market where they can get the working capital that they need to increase their production, invest in their infrastructure. And our logic is to say, well, the incentive will come from the cost of capital. So as miners are looking more intelligently to use renewable energy to have a positive impact on the grid, they will be able to attract cheaper capital. And so that logic led us to starting the first transactions with miners mostly here in the US, mostly miners that have a very strong link to energy production. So whether they're using stranded energy, flare gas, renewable energy, and kind of this conjunction.
Amazing. Muk?
I'm Mook. I'm currently first employee at Blueprint Finance. So we do kind of insurance and risk management for DeFi lending, which, as you can imagine, with the collateral kinds that we use or collateral types, is not easy. So specifically interested in insuring or covering both on-chain and off-chain assets when they're brought onto DeFi. Hence, why I'm here. Also leading the Harvard Blockchain Club and the conference, if any of you guys went last 2 weeks ago, and published the real world asset primer, the Unreal primer on real world assets, I think we called it. But Yeah, I think that's about it.
Yeah, amazing. And I want to dive right into that because, I mean, you've done so much in past, several months, several years, specifically looking at this. As you mentioned, you're one of the primary authors of that report, the Primer on Real World Assets. You also have done a lot with the RWA.xyz dashboard, this, dashboard to take stake or to keep stock of all the things that are happening in the DeFi and the real world asset space. You mentioned to me in a recent conversation that we had, you said something along the lines of, regardless of the use case, ReFi or anything else, the whole crypto space, DeFi space, is really, really hindered at, institutional adoption. There's still so many blockers. There's really not much happening with regard to institutional adoption. Let's unpack that. Like, give us a little bit more info of like where we stand with, the context of real world assets and this whole budding space. What are some of the blockers that are causing institutional adoption to be so hampered? And honestly, like, why should we even care about this? Like, what are the perceived benefits of real world assets and bringing them on chain?
Yeah, a lot of questions there. I think I'm going to tread carefully because otherwise I'll get booed off the stage. Right now, I think real world assets and crypto are not even close to where they need to be. And I think actually the space is not doing a great job in many ways. And so I guess I'm not treading carefully. I'm just going to jump into it.
No, don't hold back. Don't hold back.
But let's kind of jump in. I was just talking to Sebastien about this as well. Couple things I think are worth pointing out. Was recently writing a piece about real world asset lending called Down the Rabbit Hole. Great at these names. But basically found that these lenders are actually a lot more centralized than even their TradFi counterparts, which is kind of disappointing, right? And the reality is, especially at the underwriting stage, it's very hard to decentralize underwriting. So what does this mean? It means that you end up with these great protocols or very interesting protocols that are going after these niche long-tail borrowers, but they have no interest from lenders, right? Like, why am I putting my money into like some protocol's junior tranche to get 7% when I can get a AAA rated Apple corporate bond that is way less risky and pays pretty much the same? It just doesn't make sense. And so I guess the tagline is that I think everyone has heard before is like, there's no such thing as a bad loan, but these loans are certainly badly priced right now. Why that is, I think everyone else on stage will have some ideas too, but I think generally, going after these super small long tail markets, there's just not liquidity even in real life for these, forget about in DeFi. I think there's a bunch of others. I think I'll stop there just to like see how I answered your question. But
yeah, totally. No, I mean, spot on. And I want to give you two a chance to add on to that or reflect on that.
Yeah, actually, I would agree. The perspective that we have is that you have basically like real world assets which are trying to be fitted into like Web3, right, or DeFi, which doesn't naturally make sense because, as you said, there's already existing traditional finance solutions which are at par or better. And so trying to just like use Web3 as a new layer on top doesn't necessarily make sense. And so you're going after the long tail of weird assets which nobody really is interested in. Our perspective, and I think it's also when you said about, the fact that it's mostly centralized, we're a centralized solution, right? We run the underwriting, we onboard the miners. We work with institutions which are from traditional finance, asset managers, family offices, hedge funds, because for them, they don't really care about, the fact that there's a smart contract or anything else. What they care about is access to an asset class that interests them, but is not available currently on, other solutions. So when we come to them and we say, you can actually invest in, Bitcoin miners through contracts where you buy Bitcoin over time, that is something new. And then as long as, this is something that is well priced, they're interested. You don't need to necessarily put every asset into this bucket.
Just want to jump in real quick there is, I think what you're touching on, this idea that we described in the primer of birth versus rebirth of assets. And the rebirth assets that have been brought on chain, I think have not been doing a good job. That's my point, right? The birth of like hash powered loans, Bitcoin, like these are very natively digital assets. It makes a lot of sense to go after them right away. But yeah, anyways, just wanted to jump in and say that.
No, it's a great distinction. Kind of carrying that, but dovetailing into something else. Ryan, in some of our recent conversation, you've explained how, at least in the context of your work and, trying to drive sustainable development and impact, how the lack of standardization or the fragmentation of the standards that exist in the in the verbiage used from the TradFi space and the DeFi space, how that is a big blocker. So can you speak to us a little bit about that, and what are some of your thoughts on ways in which we can overcome that?
Yeah, so I think it really dovetails into the previous comments here, specifically about speaking the same language that's already being spoken in traditional finance, understanding that right now corporates are already harmonizing around the kind of standards and agendas to be set of what is sustainable or isn't sustainable. I was really glad to hear in earlier panels today people talking about the disclosure frameworks that already exist. And I was also discouraged to know that many of the DeFi protocols that work now don't adopt those disclosure frameworks. But the real reason why they don't is because decentralized, digital, decarbonized assets, they all tend to have different relevance and materiality components to that of traditional finance assets, right? And so understanding that means that we have to speak the same language as traditional financiers, but we need to be able to nest what we do in a language that they speak. Because if you want to access the major banks, if you want to access the sovereign wealth funds, if you want to access the key family offices that have their own ESG criteria, they're not going to invest into an asset that is wholly foreign to them in terms of the typical kind of budgetary requirements that they would need. And so for us, like we totally see that as the basis of our thesis, is that how do we actually have a framework for looking at digital assets on the whole, right? Especially impactful ones, right? If you are purporting to have some kind of impact for people and the planet, how do we have a framework that nests within all of the alphabet soup that's already happening, that much of the ESG panel that is already, slated would probably agree with? It's frameworks galore, but to be able to make a signal from that noise and make something that you can understand that DeFi can attach to and say, my asset is actually useful to a banker. The next COP that we talk about with, the burgeoning discussions around biodiversity credits will actually be about digital asset first biodiversity credits, for instance, right? And what that might look like meaningfully, right? What that could actually look like with some provenance. So that way, if you're going to measure something on the ground, it translates into an asset that has real tangible value to someone who wants to help steward that process. So I think it's really about speaking the same language first, designing a framework that does that for digital assets, and then letting everyone see that in a transparent, verifiable way. So that way they can audit and do their own investing due diligence.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that resonates very strongly with me, especially when thinking about how to take some of those existing frameworks and some of those existing processes and think about them in the context of tokenization instead of just pure, securitization. With respect to things like biodiversity credits, right? The standard process, if you will, for any type of securitization of an asset is, there's due diligence, there's underwriting, there's the securitization aspect, there's the monitoring, the reporting, all of those aspects from in this early stages of real world assets in the context of DeFi. Along that chain of events that needs to occur, where do you think some projects are doing a really good job, and where other projects, and what are the areas where there's not much activity taking place that need to be addressed?
I think even
to everybody, by the way.
That's definitely in everyone.
I need to think.
Lead the charge. A lot of the conversation that we've had today has been carbon market specific first, right? And on our platform alone, we have 50 different carbon assets, right? 50. How do you pick which one, right? What chain is it on? What are the emissions that are contributed by way of the transactions on that chain? Like, we'll tell you, we'll put an impact score to that, but it's ultimately your decision, right? Sure. It's your decision about deciding on which asset you think is going to have the most worded impact for your particular risk appetite. And I think having that first layer of saying maybe we have options is pretty significant. And then the second layer is verifying those options with subject matter experts who are doing that due diligence with us. So we have tons of partners in this space right now who are doing great MRV solutions, doing great, renewable energy solutions. They're doing that extra layer of due diligence that we can coordinate with that says, okay, this digital asset is ideal and it's using things that we agree with. That should be transparent and public, so that way, if you're of the appetite to invest in that kind of asset, you can see that and see that certification and make a more concerted opinion about if that's the right asset for you compared to the 49 other assets that might exist.
Actually, tag on question to that, which is, I think that's a core component of what you all are doing with creating the index, right, of all these projects of digital environmental assets in projects that exist around the space. talk to our audience a little bit more about that. What are you guys doing to make that, S&P 500 equivalent for this new space?
First thing is, if you're an asset that is expressing the intentionality to do something good for people and the planet, whether it's in a white paper, on your website, your core devs are explaining that in a publicly transparent, verifiable way, then that is the first step. Then we have a whole process of due diligence that says, what's your governance structure look like? What's the back end look like? What's the under the hood look like as a digital asset? Is it sort of renewable in name only, or is it actually some kind of other process that's efficacious as a digital asset for doing that good work? So we have our own due diligence process. And to make it better than the typical S&P 500 or whatever index you'd prefer to look at, we're automating most of the process, and it's already very well complete in that sense. But the part that we're not automating is a governance layer that allows community input. So if you find that there's 5 new assets that exist that want to be part of this index, they meet all the criteria, they have to be voted in, right? That way, it's actually part of an overall collective engagement. It's not done behind closed doors. It's transparent and part of the kind of pluralistic nature of inclusionary finance for the regeneration of the planet. So that's what we need. Does that answer your question?
No, yeah, absolutely. Mook, to Sebastien, any additional thoughts? If not, I've got a good, question for you, Sebastien. So I'd love for you to break down exactly from, Block Green's perspective, what you all are doing and how you, talk to us a little bit more about how you're like certifying the miners to open up this opportunity to have the capital.
We're not certifying the miners per se, right? We don't issue certification. What we do is we have our own framework, which we developed on a core element, which is, well, how is the Bitcoin mined? Right? Through which energy source? Because in the end, that's the core element. You transform electrons into Bitcoin. Bitcoin are then, traded, sold, used, and we want to relook at the source. And why do we do that? It's because we really think that looking at the source will allow discovery from, people interested to either buy directly those Bitcoin or invest in those cash flows, and will trigger also a mechanism of, as I said before, of a marketplace where the best in class will get the cheaper capital, and so will also be able to grow their operations and act as a better agent for the entire blockchain. And so how does this work? Typically, well, the miner has information on how the source energy, whether it's power bills, PPAs, where their sites are located, and we look at it from a standard perspective. We say, well, those different kind of energy sources produce greenhouse gases, and then which ones are the best in class. Number two is, well, what impact does the miner have on emissions, for example? We have miners now that are using flare gas, especially around methane, that have negative emissions. This is an interesting aspect for us to also be able to offer an exposure to those miners to the institutions which are buying their revenues. Last but not least is also the positive externalities. You have miners that are able to use, for example, the heat that they produce to warm up communities, to warm up greenhouses, to power agriculture and things like that. We put it into a rating system, and then that rating system is presented to the buyers, and they have this possibility to decide, well, I really want to be exposed to a flare gas miner, so I'm willing to give them a lower cost of capital because it's more competitive. More people are looking to buy hash rate from this miner. On the opposite side, you might have miners that are using part grid, part renewable. They might have a higher cost of capital. Therefore, the incentive will be for them to, on the next site, find sources which are more aligned with what we have on the platform. So that's the role that we play here.
Certainly. And from the institutional adoption perspective, I mean, these financial institutions that you mentioned earlier, they're really interested in investing in these assets, in getting green hash rate, if you will, so that they reap, some of the benefits when that miner wins the block reward, correct?
Exactly. So they buy cash flow. They know that on average they will be paid a certain amount of Bitcoin for the hash rate that they acquired. Here you can think about an ETP that needs to buy, regularly a certain amount of Bitcoin to keep the treasury. They want to certify that the Bitcoin that are in the ETP come from a certain grade of energy consumption. They go to us, they can buy every month 10, 20, 50 Bitcoin that comes from a set of miners. They can then, show transparently that the Bitcoin that they have in their ETP is actually coming from 4 miners, which have been, rated accordingly. They have the power agreements, they know the energy sources, they know the operation that is behind the Bitcoin that they buy. And so that creates kind of a market dynamic where demand for such Bitcoin can also, on the one hand, decrease the cost of capital, but also increase the price that they're willing to pay for the Bitcoin that are coming out of the miners as well.
But just because the miners underlying it are green does not make the Bitcoin itself green, right? Because that Bitcoin is, the collection of the network's hash rate.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You're right. It's just providing capital to agents which are, mining according to a certain set of...
Absolutely. Yeah. Wonderful. Mook, I want to turn it back over to you. Let's go back down the rabbit hole and let's talk about everything that's taken place in this space. We've talked about some of the challenges, right? From a institutional adoption perspective. We talked about this unique approach here with Block Green. Peel back another layer of the onion. Tell us more about, what you see from your side, particularly from the research angle. What is there? What pieces are there now? What's missing? And what are you looking for on the horizon?
Yeah, I think we've already talked about a little bit about how tokenization is different than securitization, but I still think it's a useful foil to look at this space and its innovation rate at. If you look at the 80s with the adoption of QSIP standards, if anyone's a real TradFi nerd here, that was a bumpy process. It was not easy, and it took the better part of 5 to 10 years, honestly. Even then, it still didn't work. So I want to contextualize, I'm roasting the space a little bit, and we have a long ways to go, but it's already been a pretty insane amount of innovation that we've seen in this so far in the last 2 to 3 years. Things that I see going well, I think that disclosure of legal agreements, the forward flow agreements, or however you're financing these things, whatever the structured product is, I think it's vital that those come out. Companies that are doing a good job, Centrifuge is a big stand here, right? They're just killer. They put out all their legal documents. They show how their SPVs are structured. That is really fundamentally important work, especially for the big guys, right? I'm talking Maple. I'm talking all these kind of protocols. Progress there. I think there's a couple protocols that are doing good work, like Centrifuge. It's not where it needs to be, and I think that's because a lot of companies are still scared. It's a competitive space right now, and I don't know how to answer the question of how to balance your competitive advantage versus the transparency that this space needs to grow in a sustainable, healthy, fast way. So I don't really know the answer there. Beyond that, I think it's interesting to hear both of your guys' both of their perspectives, because Ryan is kind of building out this infrastructure index that applies to any kind of projects within reason in the space, versus you're kind of focusing, Sebastien, on a specific use case. The way I think about it, we were just talking about this before we hopped on here, is you're trying to force oftentimes with these real world assets a square peg into a circular hole, right? And it's not ready. The infrastructure is not there and the space is not mature enough. There's no liquidity. I could go on. But I think what does make sense is starting with infrastructure that is fundamentally, from first principles, very soundly built. And that should work for on-chain assets. And if it does work for on-chain assets, it will be a no-brainer at some point for institutional capital to come on and put money in with the real world assets, right? I think the birth assets are the only real exception that only exception, but the main exception I see, in that they are fundamentally well suited for this digitally native infrastructure. And so it makes sense to start there now. In terms of, do I want to finance a bridge construction project on DeFi? Would you? I wouldn't, right? So I think it's taking baby steps, but recognizing that they add up very quickly if you're doing them right. Kind of rambled all over there, but yeah.
I agree, and especially when it comes to the kind of baby, right? There's also an aspect of being underserved by what's existing. So why do miners come to us, a young startup, 2 years old, to get liquidities? Because, well, they don't get it anywhere else. Is this a good thing, a bad thing? That's how it is. And so they need their own rails, their own kind of providers for needs which are pretty standard for any company, right? Working capital, hedging. So that makes complete sense. And I'd like to say on what you mentioned before, also on kind of those DeFi lending protocols, I think one of the big risks that I see is, of course, regulation. Why do they not disclose everything? It's because, well, it's exactly in the gray area, especially here in the US, coming from Europe, where we don't really know how to thread. People don't really know if that's going to be, security, is that an investment fund? And that lack of clarity also stops institutions from, going after such solutions. I think that's just a clear risk, which some DeFi companies or protocols are for now, I think, pretty blind.
Yeah, I think that's why I've also seen a lot more adoption in Asia than the US, just because who knows what's happening in the United States with regulation. But yeah, I just want to say that.
Even to that point, though, in the previous panel on renewable energy, like the propensity for change that's happening in the regulatory space is already so large. Like there's tons of need for that. And sustainability, financial disclosures, whatever they may look like on a sovereign nation by sovereign nation basis, they're all moving in this general trajectory. And whether that becomes a unified planetary standard or not is not really the critical point right now. It's just that if you do the right work as an organization, as a company, as a nonprofit, whatever you may be, if you do the right work at the outset and you design the infrastructure, as Muk mentioned, that is intrinsically correct in that it can actually verifiably produce an impact. You do that, when the regulation catches up, it's a perfect, amalgamation of all the potential that we're looking for. Right, because it makes it viable for investment.
Absolutely. And maybe that is the road to unlocking massive amounts of capital, institutional capital from the TradFi space. Wonderful. Well, with that, I want to kind of transition just to closing thoughts. Anything that hasn't been said, anything you want to double click on real quickly, just in, 20 seconds or less. We can go round robin. Anything that you want to make sure that is driven home?
Yeah, I mean, I'm biased. I work in risk management, but I think that people don't think about it enough, especially in this industry. You can create all the interesting structured products and loans you want, but if there's no recourse, it doesn't matter. Like, how am I getting my money back from this emerging market small business? Like, it doesn't make sense. And then second is just keeping in mind that, like, as long as there is money to lend, there will always be people to borrow it. And so instead of focusing on borrowers, we should be focusing as a space on how to be attractive to lenders. I know that's not what people want to hear, because this is antithetical to like the whole like we're rebuilding TradFi thing. But like, I think we need to be honest with ourselves and say like, this mass adoption, next billion users superhighway thing isn't going to happen if we're not getting these people to the table and they're not interested. So I think it's good to be a little realistic about that.
Sebastien.
Yeah, I fully agree actually. But one point I would add here is also around in this industry, the past years, there's been one key component that has been kind of forgotten in most cases, and it's risk. And I think understanding risk, understanding counterparty risk, and software is part of that kind of risk, has been completely underpriced. So I think also for institutions that I've seen, the crashes that we saw the last years, there's a big question mark around what exactly is that software layer providing? What is the use case? And this is for me a big component that whether you're building on any chain, any kind of infrastructure layer, you'll have to address in order to really bring this institutional money to the table.
Yeah, I just want to say, like, I'm pretty sure half the industry learned for the first time what the word rehypothecation meant, like, this year. That should not be like that. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Which works in a complete retail environment because, well, nobody asks those questions, but, it's also one of the problems of this industry.
I think one other thing that's important to think about is don't neglect geopolitics at the global and local scale. Just pay attention to that stuff. You're not in a bubble working on your own dev project, whatever it may look like. And I say that because, to the earlier point, like, do you want DeFi to help fund building a bridge? Well, maybe you don't, but like the countries do, right? And they're looking for those routes. Like countries are looking at environmental impact bonds, debt to nature swaps. They're finding ways to fund impactful solutions on the ground, and they're going to TradFi first, and they're trying to find ways to render illiquid capital further liquid, And for us, I think there's so much value in providing a digital asset forward solution that does that hard work better than TradFi can do it. So if we provide that infrastructure to do that, then it's merely just a matter of connecting dots, right? Saying you're doing something impactful on the ground, this person wants to fund you. Here's the avenue to do that. That's the seamless, most effective way possible. And everything in that, receipt process is actually going back onto something you can put in your quarterly report and make good on your promises.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And I mean, I guess you heard it here first, right? Like DeFi in real world assets, there's a great promise that by putting these assets on chain and enhancing or increasing the transparency and the verifiability of these loan structures, of this financing, that will drive mass adoption and bring in capital, institutional capital from the TradFi space and really help us scale to reach that next 2 billion users in the Web3 space. But it's not going to be easy. We got our work cut out for us. It's going to be a bumpy road, but there's a lot of amazing stuff happening. So thank you all for being here and partaking in this conversation, and looking forward to seeing what you'll do next.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.